right, welcome back to the Massive Impact Podcast. Today we have a very special guest from the distribution space. Jody Myers, who I've worked with in a previous life, is on the show today. Welcome, Jody. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So on this podcast, we talk about people and products and services, technologies that add massive impact. And in my 20 plus year career, I've kind of dabbled in distribution about 6 years or so. And we had the pleasure of working together. You were actually at the client that I worked for, but I thought that you added and add massive value and massive impact. So we're just going to jump in today to some of the questions. We'll keep it kind of brief and informal. The first one is, how would you explain the intricacies of distribution to somebody who has not worked in that space before? And is it as simple as it sounds? You know, you just put product on a truck and then you deliver it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the easy way to explain it, but I think there's a lot more to it. Obviously, in the supply chain world and distribution, there's a lot to getting that product on the truck, and there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained in getting that product on the truck. And yeah, the basics of it is, typically you have your sales side of things that orders a product and sells the product, and then you have the operations side of the business, which can go from how do you get the product into the warehouse, into the distribution center, how do you slot the product, locate it, what type of inventory management softwares do you use to handle the product and manage the inventory and the cost, what solutions do you have for receiving that product, and then anywhere from different zones, if you're in different temperature zones, how do you manage that inventory and how do you keep it at the certain temperature zones that it needs to be at to be in compliance with food and safety regulations. And then it's the purchasing side. There's a lot of metrics and a lot of knowledge that needs to go into how do you order the product and how much do you need. That's the whole acquiring the product and the whole supply chain side of it. And then you get into the warehousing side of how do you select the product? What order processing software do you use? What technology do you use to select the product with? Anywhere from pallet jacks, forklifts, automation. If you really want to get into it, you get into automation and efficiencies with automation. And I know automation has come a long way over the years. Still not quite where I think people want to see it, but and then you look at what avenue will you take to deliver that product? What size trucks? Will you deliver it on pallets? Will you deliver it on carts? Will you floor load? So there's a lot of different ways of distributing the product to the end user, and what do you do to maximize capacity on the vehicle that you're delivering that product on. So there's a lot of intricacies to distribution that require a good, strong understanding of how it all works and how it all comes together.
Yeah, and you threw some factors in there that a lot of people probably didn't even think of, and that is perishable product, having to rotate it, having to know, what goes out first and looking for breakage and just all those factors that, most people don't think of. So well stated. How would you assess the health of a distribution company? What signs would you look for, and where would you look to see if they needed improvement for a distribution company?
You first got to look at your cost per case. That's typically what you look at in distribution. What is that costing you to distribute that case or get that case to the customer? And what's your margin? But that's probably the true sign of how well a business is doing. Cases per man hour are a big is a big KPI in the distribution space. How many cases is your staff, your operation getting out per hour? So that's your all-in cases per man hour. So that's from shipping and receiving to selection to getting it on the truck to delivery. Your cases per man hour for your drivers. That's a good KPI. And then really, if you really want to get down deep, it's when you're out there, your drivers are out there on the road, what's your mile per gallon? What's your cost per mile getting it delivered to the customer? So there's a lot of different KPIs depending on the organization, but really it's cost per case. You want to try to drive that cost per case down as low as possible.
That leads to the next question. How can a distribution company become more profitable? Let's say they don't have these KPIs, or maybe they do. how would you inform them to become more profitable?
I think first you got to look at your staff, what your people are doing. There's a lot of labor standards and evaluation that you can do, but it's really cutting out cost. That's the first approach that I would look at. Is you go into an operation and you look at how they're doing things, and evaluate how they're doing things, and then you look for opportunities for improvement. But really, it's doing a labor study to see, are there time savings that could be had throughout the operation. Equipment, look at equipment. Are they using the right equipment for the right job? I've been in operations where, you have your ride-on power jacks and to use for selection, and there's been operations where they're using walk-behind power jacks for selection, so the process is extremely slow. How are they selecting? I've also been in operations where they pick stops to pallets, multiple stops to one pallet, and instead of picking, if there's 5 cases of a product, in one case going to each of the 5 stops, instead of picking all 5 cases at once, they'll make a pass through the warehouse for each stop. And that's 5 times longer to pick that stop almost, or you'd probably say 4 times longer. So you just look for opportunities for improvement, and that would be my first approach. Is you first got to get your hands around what they're doing, how they're doing it. You can't go in guns blazing and thinking that you know everything, but you got to understand. That's probably the biggest learning I found in my career is you go in and you understand how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and then you start to take the approach of how can we make it better.
Yeah, again, well said. I think the two fashions that you were talking about are warehouse friendly versus driver friendly. And that really goes back to how many times is a picker going through the warehouse? Can they just make one pass through, pick up multiple stops, multiple customers on that one pallet? Yes, it adds more digging to the driver, but it's a lot more efficient in the warehouse. This next question you've already hit on a little bit, but if you had to narrow it down to maybe 3 or 4 tools or metrics, I should say, that would kind of be a dashboard for a distribution company, what 3 or 4 metrics would you definitely capture?
Yeah, you're right. I did touch on a couple of those. It's definitely cases per man hour. That's a big one. Cost per case is another big one. And then you got to evaluate probably the next one. I mean, because you got to look at the full suite. Is your cost of inventory? How much inventory are you holding? And is it the right amount of inventory? So a lot of your dollars get tied up in inventory. And in my past experience, I worked for companies and that sit on too much inventory, or they don't have control of the inventory, and that's your biggest cost factor. So optimizing your inventory and know exactly how much you need to have on hand, that's probably a big one. So those are probably, I would say, my 3 big ones.
Nice. Yeah. And if we added a fourth, or if I added a fourth, I'd probably say inventory accuracy, just because it's everything.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Let's go into your roles a little bit. How many years of distribution experience do you have? And tell us how you got into it, how you started.
So I've been in distribution, I think since 2000, the year 2000, and kind of a funny story on how I got into it. I had a very fast-paced work ethic at a young age. I was taught a good, strong work ethic by a couple of managers at a grocery store I worked at, and really just drove a very fast-paced and upbeat attitude in me. And I had applied for a merchandiser position at Coca-Cola, and to just stock shelves. And I thought that would be a great job, and it paid more obviously than the grocery store. And I went in there for the interview, and I was highly energetic and showed a lot of enthusiasm. They loved me in the interview. They called me back and said, "Hey, we have a better opportunity for you. We would like you to get your Class B CDL and become a driver for us." And me, I was 20 years old. That was a huge opportunity, and I went through the roof and obviously jumped on the opportunity. And they trained me to get my Class B CDL and set the world on fire. And that was my first job in distribution. And as I got more and more experience in just delivery, I started to learn different aspects of the business. And then I moved into the beer and wine space about a little over a year later, had an opportunity there, and was a driver for about 2 years, and was setting the world on fire there, finishing routes faster than most guys, and got noticed by the management team. They were a company that was growing, and they had a meeting with their managers, and the meeting was to identify up and coming candidates that would be great for management. And I was one of them. And they sat down with me, and I think I was 25 years old at the time, and said, "Hey, we'd like you to be a routing manager for us. You pretty much know all the routes. Be a great opportunity for you to learn and grow." And that's where it started. I got into the routing manager position and then kept moving up from there in that company. In a few years, had a different opportunity come along and moved into an operations manager at another beer and wine distributor, and came in there and did what I had said earlier in the meeting. Just took in how they were doing it. That's where I met Patrick, and took in how things were being done and got a good understanding of how the operation was running and how I could improve it. And completely re-racked the entire facility on a shoestring budget. And Patrick knows and remembers those
If that,
times. It was,
if
yeah,
even that.
yeah, it was. Yes, it was a very, yeah. I got hand-me-down racking, used racking from one of the other facilities, and literally me and three other guys tore down the entire racking in that location and relaid out the warehouse and put up new racking over a 3-month period. And that required us to tear down the pick path for what was being picked each day and then have it put back together for the night crew to pick, because we had to continue to operate during this time. All while also fighting a union that right before I got hired, the drivers had voted in a union. So I have a broad background in union experience and had to sway the opinion of the drivers, and was very successful there, to which they decertified and voted the union out a year later. And so I had a lot of accomplishments in those first 2 years, which then led me to being promoted to director of operations there and overseeing multiple facilities, and doing the same in much larger facilities, doing completely re-racking projects. By the time I left there, that company had 9 locations, and I had successfully re-racked 4 of those 9 locations. So I've had a
Nice.
lot of success in my career. Yeah.
Now, elaborate a little bit on when you say pick path sequence and re-racking. What does that mean to people
So
that aren't
yeah, so
familiar?
in the distribution space, obviously you have to have a location for every item that you sell, and it's got to be in an organized way so that the selector that's selecting it can move in a flow. So just if you think about when you're in a grocery store, you walk down an aisle and things are in a certain order, and they stay that way. And it's easy for you as a customer to select those items and to shop those items. It's similar in a warehouse environment. So as you're selecting things, there's a little bit more to it, obviously, but when you're laying out a warehouse and you're trying to optimize it for efficiency, you want to have it laid out to where your products that are larger in size are at the beginning of that pick so that they're base products. So when you're in by velocity, so you want your faster moving products at the beginning of the pick, so you get those items on the bottom of the pallet and you select those all at once. And then as you move through the warehouse, you try to group your same size products together so it's easier to build a pallet. So you get your sales. It's got to, you got to think about your sales. You got to think about how you're going to restock that product, and you got to
Hmm.
think about the size of the product. And that's kind of how you lay a warehouse out. So you kind of go in that order, and you make it so that similar to when you're in a grocery store, the selector goes up one aisle, and then as they go to the next aisle, they go back down. It's no different than a grocery store when you're shopping, and they are selecting products along the way. And they're typically, in most warehouse environments, they're wearing a headset that will tell them what to select. So it'll tell them what location to go to. And in most environments, there's a check digit on that location sticker. So no different than a price tag at a grocery store. You have a location sticker that has the location on it, and then it has the product description, and it'll have like a numerical check digit. And so the headset will tell them, go to this location. They'll roll up to that location. It'll then ask them to read that product specific check digit. And they have to read that back to the headset. That will then tell the headset that they're at the right location. And then it'll tell them how many to select from that location. And then they validate that with how many they selected back to the headset. And then once they've done that validation, it'll send them to the next product. That's typically how voice picking works, and there's obviously many different technologies out there on how that works and some variations. But that's typically so when you're optimizing or you're laying out a warehouse, you want it set up in aisles similar to what you see in a grocery store, and you want somebody to flow down that aisle. So as they're selecting, they're on a ride-on power jack and a headset, and they're picking cases as they go along, and in a flow, so that they can make one pass through the entire warehouse or the entire pick area, and complete that order within that one pass. And that also reduces congestion. So that way, every associate that's selecting orders they're all flowing in the same direction. So there isn't any, intersections or areas where they, could run into each other for safety. So that's
Yeah.
typically what it involves.
Yeah. I like the analogy of the grocery store. I think that a lot of people think warehousing is just a very fluid, oh, there's a spot over there, put it there, but it's not. It's a science. And it would be very chaotic if a grocery store operated in such a manner where every week the cereal is in a different aisle or a different location as locations open up. You're right. It's very much a science. What challenges do you see most distributors kind of struggle with?
Well, I think the biggest one is not having standard KPIs and measurables. I mean, I think you know that in your broad experience in manufacturing that you got to have something to measure off of. So you go into a lot of companies that they don't have any KPIs or any ways to measure. They don't know how well they did the year prior or the month prior or the quarter prior. That's probably one of the biggest for me. Would say another one is getting stuck in the old ways, not changing. The old saying, if you're not changing, you're dying. That's a big one. You go into a lot of companies that you say, hey, why do you do it that way? And they say, well, it's just the way we've always done it. Okay, well, have you ever looked at, maybe doing it different and maybe being more efficient? You get some of that, that's probably your biggest encounter in the distribution space or any consulting world or avenue is that's just the way we've always done it. Well, you get that old thinking and you never change and you never improve. And that's probably been the biggest hurdle I've experienced in my career is, challenging people that have done it the same way for 20, 30 years and people that are a lot more senior and been doing it longer than you, getting them to change their mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that applies to every industry that I go into. You hit on automation earlier. Do you think that's always the solution?
No, I don't actually. And in my most recent career as an executive general manager at a distribution company, that was something that we've explored quite a bit and quite extensively, primarily to keep selectors out of the freezer, because that's a job that people just don't want to do, and rightfully so. I mean, it's something I wouldn't want to do. So we've explored a lot of opportunities in automation. We visited a lot of DCs, Meyer DCs and distribution, Amazon DCs to see how we can use automation to keep our associates out of the freezer. And it's been a challenge. There isn't really anything out there that keeps you completely out of the freezer. In some capacity, somebody's got to be in that freezer. So I don't know that there is an ideal solution yet. Just in total automation, I think there's, parts and pieces or areas that you could use automation in to help you. But I don't think there is a full suite that is the all-encompassing solution just yet.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also take it down, kind of water it down one more level. You and I are very familiar with conveyor solutions, which are somewhat semi-automated as well. And I think more often than not, that's not the optimal solution, at least from what I've seen in my experience. There may be better, solutions out there today than there were 5 years ago when I was in the space. But what are your thoughts on conveyors?
Yeah, I think for the right channel and the right product, you look at Amazon, their entire distribution facility is run on conveyors. But that's, they're a piece-driven operation, so it works very well for them. They don't palletize anything; they literally unload. Their trucks come into their warehouse, stacked from the floor to the ceiling, and they unload them, or if they are palletized and they come in, they depalletize them, put them in bins, and they use conveyor throughout the entire facility. And you look at some operations that, if they have similar or like products, conveyor could work where you have a palletizer at the end of the rack. I've seen beer distributors that conveyors work very well in an automation space, but there's still labor involved. At every point in that conveyor, you have locations throughout that system that somebody is throwing the cases on the conveyor. And then at the end of that conveyor, there's a palletizer that will palletize depending on what solution or technology you use. So I think that there are, good opportunities for conveyor systems. But I think in most of the conveyor systems that you and I, Patrick, have experienced are manual, where you have a conveyor system that's motorized, but you have selectors that stand in one spot throughout that system. and they're manually picking product off the shelf and then just pushing it down the conveyor. And to me, that's not optimal.
Yeah, and the problem with a lot of conveyor solutions when it's one sort of serpent through the warehouse is typically you can only load one truck at a time with that solution, and then if one person, stops up the line, the whole team is waiting, or there's just a number of issues with it. Let's change the topic here for a minute to I know you've been through a few mergers and acquisitions. Were those fun or brutal?
You know, today I think as I've gotten older, I don't know that they'd be much fun. But in my early days, I went through a lot of them. Primarily to kind of take it back, a lot of the acquisitions I went through were in my early days in the beer and wine distribution space. Back in 2008, I know it made big news when Miller and Coors merged, and in Ohio, that caused a big rift in distribution. There's a lot of franchise laws in Ohio, and Miller was going around and yanking distribution licenses from different distributors, which opened up an opportunity that if you were a big enough distributor in the space, Superior Beverage back in that time, you had the opportunity to acquire those smaller Coors distributors in Miller distributors, and that's what they did. So in 2008, uh, they bought 3 distributors in 1 year. And that was just at the beginning of my management career. I just started in '05 in management, and man, was that it was exciting. It was fun. We did all the racking ourselves. That's where I learned a lot of the racking. That's where I learned a lot of my experience is from that company, and it was just nonstop. I mean, it was 16-hour days every day, and it was slotting and putting product away and making sure it's selected, making sure trucks get out on time. It was a crazy wild time. So back then I was young and full of energy. So yeah, I would say it was fun back then. Today, not as exciting. I just as you get older and there's other things that excite you in your career. But no, I don't know that. Maybe if it was the right opportunity, I would say it's exciting.
Yeah. Okay, moving along here, we got a couple more questions. Where does opportunity exist for distributors to expand their footprint or their territory, kind of along the lines of mergers and acquisitions? How do those kind of come about? How does a distributor grow, essentially?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the space you're in. Obviously, there's a sales component in the beverage world, food and beverage world. There's obviously sales and market share. Opportunities for growth as performance. If you're a top performing distributor, similar to the company that I most recently with, if you're a top performing distributor, that opens up opportunities with the customers that you have. And for them example, or for us, it's been a huge opportunity for growth and to add distributors around the country. It's really your performance as a distributor. If you're an efficient distributor and you can distribute product at a low cost for your vendors or whoever your customer is, that's where the biggest opportunity. So that's why it's so important to have an efficient operation that's reducing costs and cutting and always looking at continuous improvement, which
Yeah,
that's a big one that you taught me back when we first met, was continuous improvement.
agree.
Yes,
Yeah,
a good catchphrase.
yeah,
But that's
exactly.
really it. That's
Yeah,
really it.
no, I agree. I agree. Well said as well. I guess last question before we end this podcast. How difficult would it be? Let's just stay in the beverage space.
Mhm.
How difficult would it be to start a distribution company today, ground up?
Oh, it's that's a good question. I think it would be pretty hard. I mean, there's a lot of pieces that go into it. Again, from the supply, I guess the supplier end of it. Whose products are you going to sell? Where are you going to warehouse those products? It's all about relationships. You got to develop relationships with certain vendors and suppliers, and what sells. You need to do a lot of research on the right products to carry. It's similar to you see the drop shipping space and the TikTok shops of the world and the Amazon drop shipping, and there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. How are you going to sell that product? Do you need a sales team to sell it, or is it a good product that sells itself, or can you sell it online? Um, then you need to have the warehousing. Then you got to have racking. You got to have a good sized warehouse for the amount of product you need to hold. And where are you going to come up with the funds? How can you get finance? Where do you get the capital to finance a big project like that? the selectors, the workers. That's probably the hardest thing right now in today's market, and I think anybody in any space can attest to this, is the workforce. As we get into a world where there's so many more opportunities for people to work from home, or the gig space, or to work when they want. Finding laborers today is a big challenge for every company across the United States, manufacturing, distribution, supply chain, whatever you want to call it. That's probably your hardest challenge, is where are you going to find the workers? I think it would be hard to set something up in today's climate.
Yeah, it's just a huge investment, and this could be an entirely different podcast episode. But a lot of the clients that I service today, I hear them sort of murmuring, looking into a 3PL, third-party logistics. So maybe they distribute the product today. They make it, they distribute it today. Maybe they look at just making it, just manufacturing it, and subbing out the actual distribution, because it's a lot. It's a lot of headache, a lot of investment, a lot of moving pieces.
Yes, absolutely.
You talked about the labor portion of that. You and I have both worked many night shifts where you start off full and somebody gets sick or somebody gets injured or what have you, and suddenly you're anemic. Your crew is imploding.
Yeah,
that's probably the biggest challenge.
And we're selecting. That's the fun
exactly.
of distribution.
Yeah, and the job isn't done until the last piece is picked. It's not like the night shift can just walk away after 8 hours.
Yeah, and that's the downside for them. They stay until it's selected. So if 5 guys call off and you got a big night, guess what? Everybody's working 12, 13 hours, and that's not good for morale either. So it's a tough world. Distribution is a tough world, and in a lot of distribution, it's sell one day, get it on the truck the next day. That's impressive. I mean, that you can have a sales department out there, and that's primarily the beverage, food and beverage space. Is you typically have sales reps hitting the road, and they get done with their orders by 5 p.m. that day, and those orders are then transmitted, and then they're processed and routed, and then they get put out to selection. They get selected overnight and get loaded on the trucks for next day delivery. It's a pretty impressive what the Coke and Pepsis and the beer and wine distributors of the world, the U.S. Foods, all those different food and beverage companies, what they do every day, and the quick turnaround, and to make sure that you're staffed to handle that. And in those worlds too, you have big peak days. Sales reps have goals they got to hit. So it's every day is a mystery. That's probably the most fun about it, though, is that no day's the same in distribution. You could have a really light night, and then you could have a big night the next night, and but you have the same amount of people. You got to figure out how to get them both done.
Right, and there's no real ever downtime. It never stops. You think about holidays. You can't just shut down on a holiday. That's probably your biggest night.
Yeah, that's when we work the most. And in most of my career, I have never been able to take vacation. A lot of people get vacation between Christmas and New Year's. They love to get that week off. I've never once in my career had that week off, because those are the peak selling season of most distribution companies. You're selling beer and wine, or you're selling food, or whatever the case may be. So there is no vacation. A lot of companies, it's nobody takes vacation from November on to the end of the year, which is crazy.
Yeah, another little sort of fun fact, at least where you and I had worked, I think 40% of the annual sales occurred just between October through December.
Yeah. So not only do you not get vacation, you're working your butt off, and you're working more hours than you do the most of the year. So
exactly,
that's the trade-off. It's the beer and wine world's a fun industry to work in, but you work hard. I know many people that I've met throughout the years, like, oh, you work in beer and wine, that's got to be all gravy. No, you work really hard, but there are a lot of perks and a lot of fun to be had. But you work for it, absolutely.
Definitely. Well, I think that wraps it up, Jody. Thanks for joining the Massive Impact Podcast. If you guys have not yet subscribed, do so in the link below. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.